This is Politics Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Mike Waltz is a Republican member of Congress from Florida, a former Green Beret in the US Army, and a member of the House Armed Services Committee. As someone who has a lot of experience in combat as well as making policy, he has interesting thoughts to share on what's happening right now in Ukraine, what's likely to happen in days ahead, and how responses from policymakers in the US and Europe are evolving. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation with live audience questions. To hear past episodes or find out how to join us, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever podcast streaming service you're using right now, so you don't miss our next episode coming this Wednesday with former Congressman Joe Walsh. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
As this war transitions into urban warfare with the Russian tactics, what does that look like on the battlefield?
I'll tackle that from a couple of different perspectives. I can tell you, for the people of Ukraine, this is going to sadly and tragically get much worse before it gets better. The Soviet-Russian doctrine is to initially attempt precision strikes, to attempt to decapitate the non-friendly government. But when that doesn't work, as it's not working for the Russians now, historically they go to siege warfare, mass casualties. You know, what they can't get done with precision strikes, they just bring in the heavy artillery and literally start laying waste to city blocks. They did it in Afghanistan in the 80s. They did it in Chechnya in the 90s. They've done it in Syria the last decade. And we're starting to see them shift in that direction in Ukraine. From a defensive standpoint, from the Ukrainian resistance standpoint, look, there's the most vulnerable places in Russian armor are in the top and in the rear. So for weight reasons, when you construct a tank, you put all of your armor in the front and in the sides, and then you kind of shave down on the top and the rear to make it a little bit lighter. That means that with anti-tank weapons, if we would get them the appropriate weapons that they need, they'll be able to attack that armor pretty effectively from buildings, from the rubble of those buildings if they've been destroyed, and to use sewer systems, subway systems, and other means to get around behind the rear. That was one of the Russians' big problems in Chechnya. And then finally, it takes a lot of fuel, a lot of spare parts, a lot of supplies and resupply to maintain a force from the Russian standpoint. Those resupply convoys tend to be in lightly armored trucks. They're relatively easy to attack if you can get at them. Again, from an insurgency, Green Berets, my background as a Green Beret, as a special operator, we focus on guerrilla warfare. And that's where I expect the Ukrainians to be focused, is cutting off those supply lines. And then you isolate those Russian armored units in the cities, and they will become vulnerable.
If the worst case scenario does happen, Congressman, and the city is encircled, again, you're a Green Beret, you're an expert in this stuff. What would the Ukrainian forces try and do to break that siege, and what weapons would they need?
First, they're going to try to prevent the encirclement. It's critical that the Ukrainians keep some type of supply corridor into the city. Obviously, for humanitarian reasons, Kyiv is a city of 3.5 million people. It's very large. It's spread out. It spans the major river that runs through north to south through the country of Ukraine, called the Dnieper River. And they have to keep a supply corridor open from the west. So all of these arms that you hear about, and medical supplies, foodstuffs, they need light anti-armor weapons. Those look like kind of modern day bazookas. If you remember that from World War II, we've been pushing them javelins. Those are more suited for kind of open country out in the farm fields, more in the rural areas than it is necessarily for urban warfare because of the type of missile. And really what they need are Stingers. Those are anti-aircraft missiles that they've been asking for months and months and months. And the Biden administration just started pushing in the last few days. It's really shameful and unacceptable. And the Ukrainians were asking for it. members of Congress, including myself, who visited Ukraine last year, were demanding that they be sent. And what they kept hearing from the White House is, well, we don't want to provoke Putin. This is before the invasion. We don't want to be too escalatory. We don't want to provoke him into taking action, when in actuality, the opposite is what happened. By not providing them the arms that they need, by not turning Ukraine into a porcupine, and hopefully getting inside Putin's calculus that this could be a lot harder for him than he had anticipated, it in many ways made him think that this would be relatively easy. And I find that tragic and frustrating that we didn't arm them sooner and better with what they were asking for. Had they had stingers on day one, I think we'd see a very different situation.
Due to the Biden administration's objections to send those arms free flowing into the country, are we too late?
Well, it depends on how fast they get there. We may be too late for Kyiv and Kharkiv, their second biggest city in the east. You can imagine a map moving from east to west as you're moving from the Russian border west towards the Polish border. The farther west you go, the population tends to be less ethnic Russian and more ethnic Ukrainian and more European oriented. So even if Putin takes Kyiv and he takes Kharkiv, and even Odessa, I cannot imagine he'll have the combat power, the number of forces to push all the way through the mountains that are in the west to the Polish border, which means you're going to have some type of rump Ukrainian state left. I pray Zelensky can stay alive and continue to inspire his people to resist, but you will have a piece of Ukraine left from which a resistance can be staged. And if that happens, I think you could have, eventually this will settle down to a bit of a stalemate. But again, when you've got 5 million people trapped between those two cities, it's going to be a massive humanitarian crisis before we get to that point.
What can you do? Can you pass legislation, for example, tomorrow mandating specific weapons get there in a specific time frame? Or what type of congressional action can you be a leader on to help these freedom fighters out?
Well, from the congressional standpoint, obviously we approved the funding. And just so you understand how the aid is actually flowing in, before the invasion, we were flying it in. And you heard about a $200 million package in December. That's not $200 million in cash that we give to the Ukrainians and then they buy stuff with. We actually go to our military warehouses and pull out body armor and helmets and rifles and javelin missiles, and we actually ship it over. That's why you hear it called a drawdown, because we're drawing down from our existing military supplies and sending it over. I don't think what the administration sent then was soon enough. And I don't think what we're sending now is big enough. Why didn't that come up specifically in Biden's State of the Union? Why didn't he look over his shoulder to Pelosi and say, I hope you'll have this on the floor of the House of the Representatives tomorrow? Because the request is kind of sitting there. Why aren't we voting on it? And that's what we continue to press. And, unfortunately, we're in the minority. So ultimately, it's up to Speaker Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in the Senate. But I'm working with like-minded Democrats like Seth Moulton. He and I traveled to Ukraine together last year to demand that of their leadership. That's what we should be voting on right now, so that the administration is fully authorized. And then we, from an oversight standpoint, kind of pound on the administration to get it done sooner than later.
We're talking a lot about the provision of lethal aid, and you've been such a big outspoken proponent of providing this kind of aid to support the Ukrainians. You're just speaking about how you've been putting pressure both within Congress and on the administration to do more. Can I ask you about how disappointed were you in the previous administration when they blocked the congressionally appropriated aid?
And the previous amendment, what do you mean when they blocked the aid?
The congressionally appropriated aid providing the Javelin anti-tank missiles and so on to the Ukrainian government when it was held up by the previous administration in the attempt to get the president of Ukraine to make an announcement about investigations inside of the Ukrainian justice system.
So, I mean, if you're referring to the now infamous phone call that was released, if you actually look at the verbiage, there was a discussion about javelins. There was a discussion that the javelins are going to continue. Then the issue was, he said, but hey, I need you to do me a favor and to look into these servers. And we all know what happened in terms of impeachment and those pieces. But there was not a blockage of aid that I'm aware of. In fact, if you just look at the funding that's come out of Congress, I mean, I'm looking at 2017, $250 million. It jumped up to nearly 400 million. By 2020, it was nearly $500 million. I mean, that aid flowed. And in fact, what's important to remember is Putin got away with this with invading Ukraine in 2014. And the Obama administration literally threw blankets at the problem. Blankets and MREs refused to provide lethal aid. That shifted under the Trump administration. They would not have the javelins, the arms, ammunition that they have now, had that not been provided by the previous administration. It was a policy shift. It was deliberate. And part of Putin's calculus, I believe, was that now that you have the same team around Biden as you had around Obama, that he thought once again he could get away with it with relatively little repercussions.
Congressman, we all, of course, share, your positivity that the aid did impact flow. But isn't it correct that the Government Accountability Office and GAO released a report where they found that there was, in fact, a freeze of aid?
If you're talking about the back and forth within, parts of that GAO report were inconclusive. And part of it still is held up in executive privilege. I mean, that was part of the criticism of the impeachment and the way the impeachment investigation went down was that if you look what happened under Nixon, it took a couple of years because those executive privilege issues were worked out by the courts. The Democrats in the House didn't want to wait. They didn't want to take it to the court. And that's why there were relatively narrow charges in terms of what they believe President Trump did. So, I mean, I'm looking at the actual funding that we approved. The javelins that were there in 2019 were there because they were delivered. The javelins that he was talking about on that call were delivered. We actually sold them. And in that call, if you relook at the transcript, he promises to keep them flowing. So I don't know, man, that's my answer. I think at the end of the day, if you look at what didn't happen from 2016 to 2020, it was the first presidency in the 21st century, the only, where Putin didn't invade someone. He invaded Georgia under President Bush. He, of course, invaded Ukraine under President Obama and President Biden. So I'm looking at the actual effect of the actions. And, the other piece that's important to remember is in Syria, more Russians died under the previous administration than in any other administration since the Cold War. What I'm referring to was our military was authorized to bomb and to attack Russian mercenaries that were attacking our soldiers. And then you couple that with, if we want to go into actual policy actions, we also withdrew from the INF Treaty because of Russian violations. We withdrew from the Open Skies Treaty because of Russian violations. So if you look at the actions that occurred, even outside of that phone call, it was a very tough policy on Russia.
There's a growing bipartisan agreement that America should ban the importation of Russian oil. Speaker Pelosi, Lauren, really surprised me by being so much in favor of a ban that Russian oil.
You surprised me too.
There's been a push by some Democrats to ban the import of Russian oil. Where do you stand?
I'm all for that. Ban it.
Ban the oil.
Ban the oil come from Russia. Yep.
She's not alone. Senators Elizabeth Warren and Joe Manchin also say it is time to stop funding Putin's war.
So let's move on then to how this administration is responding to the escalation. Let's talk about sanctions. So Speaker Pelosi called for sanctioning the Russian energy exports. And this is a step that the U.S. and U.S. partners have been reluctant to take so far. With this new proposal from the speaker, can you tell us how much support do you think there is for placing sanctions on Russian energy exports? And do you think that it could happen? And if the president and the administration don't act, do you expect that Congress will act in this regard?
It's a complicated question. First, we have to look at the effect on our European allies. 40 to 50% of Germany's gas is dependent on Russian exports. About 30% of Turkey's gas is dependent. Hungary, which is landlocked, is completely dependent. My question then is, how do we replace it? It's easy to say. It's become a "I'm tough on Russia" talking point, which we just heard from Speaker Pelosi, to say stop those exports because that's how he's funding this war. I don't disagree. What I would like to see in the next sentence, though, is a realistic assessment of how are we going to replace it, not only for Europe, but for the United States. We've actually doubled our imports of Russian oil just in the last year. And by the way, if we cut that off, that's about 7 to 8% of our supply. That means prices are going to go higher. People are going to even pay more at the pump, and it's going to drive inflation even higher because everything that has to be transported now costs more. So what I'd like to see in the next sentence, what I would have loved to have seen from Biden at the State of the Union, is how he is going to unleash American energy. We had plans in place, and it was moving forward to export significant amounts of liquefied natural gas to Germany, to Ukraine, and to Turkey. That has been rolled back. I'd like to see that undone. Of course, there's been a ton of talk about the Keystone Pipeline, the revoking leases on federal lands, the no more drilling in Alaska. I can tell you, in talking to oil and gas investors, they are extremely hesitant to invest in this environment because they're afraid they're going to be regulated to death. So the amount of capital for our oil and gas industry has really dried up just in the last year. So I know that was a long-winded explanation, but if you're going to say cut off Russian oil and gas, which means cutting off our Europeans and the United States, then what are we going to replace it with? And my answer is unleash American energy. And that's what we need to hear from the speaker, and that's what we need to hear from the president.
Yes, we actually had a sort of progressive campaigner on this program. We pushed him on this point, and we asked, are you prepared to support an increase in American production of energy? And we actually got the guest, to sort of concede on the point. Of course, it would also involve some kind of coordination with the other international producers. But let me ask then just a last question about the sanctions.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, please.
Because I'm also on the science committee here in Congress. And we had the Secretary of Energy before our committee, and she admitted in that hearing, Biden's Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, that the type of gas moving through Nord Stream 1 and that would have moved through Nord Stream 2 is some of the dirtiest form of gas in the world, the most polluting and the most harmful to the environment. So the environmental argument of really clamping down on American gas, but then driving the world towards the Russians doesn't hold up either. It just doesn't make sense. And that's from his Secretary of Energy. So the next time you have progressives on, please raise that with them. Russians pumping more gas is actually worse for the environment. American gas, the type of gas, is some of the cleanest in the world. And I'm all for a transition. I'm all for moving to energy diversity and more towards a green economy, but you can't do it overnight. As we push towards a green economy, that means you're pushing obviously towards solar, towards wind, towards battery storage. Those minerals are mined primarily by the Chinese, who control now 90% of the world's critical minerals that go into those batteries and panels. The panels are being made with slave labor by the Uyghurs at the end of a barrel of a gun, literally. So from a human rights standpoint, it's awful. Their labor laws are non-existent. So it's literally almost slave labor in the mines. And by the way, the type of mining that they do to produce all of the green things we want here in the United States is some of the most polluting. So it's a much more complex issue. I get it's a bumper sticker to say go green and we're worried about the climate. But when you actually peel back the layers, the argument doesn't hold up.
So I want to ask one last question then about the sanction strategy, because if the sanctions are intended to produce action on the part of the Russians, they have to be tied to a clear set of goals. Are we just trying to isolate Russia for its own sake, or is there a plan for how these specific sanctions could be lifted if Russia were willing to accept specific available off-ramps? Do we have a clear path for how this is going to play out in regard to the sanctions policy?
Not one that's been articulated to me. But what you just described was the crux of the reason so many of us were demanding that sanctions go in place pre-invasion. You put those sanctions in place, you start seizing his oligarchs' yachts and villas and assets. You start clamping down on their banking sector. You do that incrementally on the front end with the assurance during negotiations that, hey, when you de-escalate, we de-escalate. We'll pull these back when we see Russian soldiers moving away from the border. Doing it after the fact, now that we have tanks sitting in Ukrainian cities, again, is really late and too little. Going forward, in terms of a de-escalation of our sanctions or a strategy of our sanctions, along with a de-escalation or an off-ramp with the Russians, I've asked and we haven't received satisfactory answers. I think right now the thing that's going to most deter Putin and his generals is if he believes that this is going to bog down for him militarily. If this is going to become another Afghanistan like it was for the Soviets in the 80s or Chechnya in the 90s, and that he is going to have to constantly drain his resources to supply this effort. And when, frankly, sadly, Russian body bags are going home to Russian mothers, I believe, at least in the short term, that's the only thing that's going to affect his calculus, because from everything we've been briefed, he's all in. He knows his grip on power will be severely damaged if he's perceived as losing this effort. So you're going to see wave after wave until they just pound the Ukrainians into submission.
Thank you for that, sir. We're going to go to maybe 2 or 3 audience questions, folks. We have about 10 minutes left. So we will start with Andy, and then we will go to Nas for the first 2 questions.
Do you think that if Russian troops invaded a NATO country, then that's it, World War III, end of humanity? Do you think Putin would ever risk that? Where do you think we stand in the genuine kind of nuclear war scenarios?
So 2 answers there. One, just understanding Russian doctrine and Soviet doctrine before that. They believe in being able to escalate, what they call escalate to de-escalate. And they have extensive stockpiles of tactical nuclear weapons. We have reduced ours greatly. There is a belief that they could use tactical nuclear weapons, which are small, low yield, but nuclear, with the belief that we wouldn't respond with an ICBM, and therefore they could get away with it. I don't see Putin going there, but where I do see him going is just below the threshold of nuclear, which are these mass casualty causing thermobaric weapons and other types of perhaps even chemical. The thing I fear in terms of NATO getting drawn in is probably a little more incremental. For example, if Poland is serving as a sanctuary for a Ukrainian resistance and keeping it alive with supplies and ammo and other types of weapon, at some point, Russia is going to want to shut that down, shut that border down, and the risk for collateral damage is very high. And once you start shooting down Polish planes or bombing Polish trucks or Romanian trucks, that's a NATO ally, and by treaty, we have to intervene. The other piece is cyber and Putin enacting or retribution through cyber. And then finally, I would point to Turkey, and that Turkey, I think, boldly has said no more Russian warships can pass through the Dardanelles and the Bosporus. Those are the straits that pass by Istanbul and lead into the Black Sea. How do they enforce that if Russia tests that? And by the way, Turkey is dependent on about 30% of its energy needs on Russia as well. So there's a lot of things that could get very dicey very quickly. And if a NATO country gets pulled in by treaty, the United States and the United Kingdom and everybody's in, and that could escalate very quickly.
We will go next to Nas for the next question.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you, John and Justin. Energy is my interest, professional interest, as well as an important subject. Russia produced 10.5 million barrels of crude oil a day, not just gas. Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates make it very clear that they are not going to increase production. Right. The price of crude oil today is the highest since 2008. Inflation definitely will be impacted greatly. So what are the alternatives? That's number one. And if we impose sanctions on Russia, that would require closing the Suez Canal for the Russian ships, not just the Bosphorus? And how can we enforce that?
Well, it's a great point. So to my earlier point, again, if we're going to shut off Russian oil and gas, which is coming to the United States as well in pretty significant quantities, we have to replace it with something. And my obvious next statement is it needs to be replaced with American oil and gas. And our production, from the statistics I've seen, has dropped from a high just about 18 months ago of 13 million per day down to around 11. So I think we have capacity to increase. We had plans in place to be sending, and we should be sending fleets of LNG ships into the terminals in Germany that they've now reversed themselves on, amongst other things that Germany has recently reversed itself on. I think one of the stories out of this is the wake-up call that Europe has received, not only on its dependency on Russian oil and gas, but also in its defense spending. Another small piece of this, but an important one, is Venezuela. And part of the reasons we've increased our import of Russian oil is that, for obvious reasons, on Maduro and the sanctions there and his oppressive regime, we've reduced greatly, almost to zero, our imports from Venezuela. So it has to come from somewhere. Again, from a job standpoint, from an environmental standpoint, because our gas in particular is much cleaner, and from a national security standpoint, we have to unleash American energy. And then I think a final piece to that is this growing kind of resurgence of Russian and Chinese cooperation. It really went underreported, but in the opening ceremonies, the Putin-Xi summit, the Russia-China summit, and the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, they signed a West Siberian gas deal, a pipeline to move through Mongolia and into China. China is really serving as the back door to these sanctions, and they will serve as an important new market for Russia if we continue to diminish the European market. And I think that's going to drive those two together, and it has all types of implications.
The last question that I'd love from you, you're a strong conservative, you're in Florida, in a conservative district. We are seeing a lot of private sector companies step up. We're seeing a lot of governors step up and begin to increase the sanctions that they are creating. What do you wish you'd see from Governor DeSantis, understanding that there is a ton of Russian oligarch money flowing through Miami? Is there anything that can be done at the state level, or is this something that needs to be done at the federal level?
That's a great question, and something we'll dig into. The Florida legislature is actually, they only meet a few months of the year, and is actually in session right now. I think it'll be a mix of the two, but I think it'll primarily be federal in terms of banking restrictions, sanctions. Look, if you're a real estate agent, not all Russians are bad. If you're selling to one, but not others, who can you sell to? We need to give clarity to the private sector of what's off limits and what's sanctioned and what's not. But I certainly agree with you. There is all of our cities, not just Miami, New York, LA. We could go down the list that are awash with Russian oligarch money. And I think that's really how you get inside Putin's head and his calculus and rattle his cage, is when you start rattling their cages. I'll come back to you guys. I think that's a great point. What can we do at the state level to complement what is primarily, I think, a federal effort?
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Congressman Mike Waltz, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation with live audience questions. To hear more past episodes or find out how to join us, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Wednesday with former Congressman Joe Walsh. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team, thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.